Prince William allegedly is planning a very different coronation for himself. Too soon?
Although you kind of know that this might happen, you don't really think about it very much. Not least of all because the monarchy is about continuity. But I think for my brother, this is something he's been waiting for.
Power doesn't collapse with headlines. It vanishes in silence. Behind the guarded walls of the House of Windsor, no cameras rolled and no statements were issued. Yet something irreversible shifted at the heart of the monarchy. What happens when influence is removed without a single public word? In a move as precise as it was quiet, Princess Anne is said to have redrawn the lines of authority, leaving Queen Camilla on the outside of decisions shaping the crown's future. No public clash, no dramatic fallout, just a silent recalibration of power, the kind that alters an institution long before the world realizes it has changed. Anne's silent coup. To understand the magnitude of what just happened, you first have to understand the woman who made it happen. Princess Anne is not like any other royal you have watched on television or seen waving from a carriage. She is something rarer and far more formidable. She is the monarchy's conscience. While the rest of the family has spent years managing their public image, crafting careful narratives, and chasing the approval of a fickle modern audience, Anne has operated on a completely different frequency. She believes in one thing above all else: duty. Not the polished, photogenic version of duty that gets you magazine covers, but the raw, unglamorous, lifetime commitment to an institution that asks everything of you and offers very little in return. She has lived that commitment every single day, without complaint and without fanfare. And that is precisely what makes her so dangerous when she decides something has gone wrong. Her tension with Camilla was never about jealousy or personal dislike in the pettiest sense. It was something far more structural and far more serious. It was a clash between two completely different ideas of what it means to sit beside the throne. Camilla's path to the crown was one of the most extraordinary image rehabilitation campaigns in modern history.
We close tonight with the extraordinary transformation of a woman once reviled as a royal homewrecker. At age 75, she is now just days away from being crowned the Queen.
She went from being publicly despised to being publicly accepted through years of careful media management, sympathetic press coverage, and patient positioning. To the world watching from the outside, it was a remarkable transformation. But to Princess Anne, watching from the inside, it felt like something else entirely. It felt like the institution being bent to accommodate a personal story. It felt like the rules being quietly rewritten, not for the good of the monarchy, but for the comfort of an individual. And for a woman who has never once bent a rule for her own comfort, that was intolerable. Over the years, Anne watched with growing unease as Camilla's influence inside the palace began to expand, in ways that felt inconsistent with the traditional role of a consort. There were moments at diplomatic events where Camilla stepped into conversations that Anne believed were not hers to lead. There was an increasingly assertive presence in ceremonial discussions, a subtle but unmistakable sense of ownership over protocol that Anne viewed as an overreach. None of these things were broadcast publicly. None of them made headlines. But in the language of the royal court, where every gesture carries the weight of centuries of precedent, they were screaming. And Anne heard every word. There was a private moment at Balmoral, recalled by those who were present, where Anne remarked to a trusted confidant that some people wear the crown for duty, while others wear it merely for appearance. She mentioned no names. She did not need to. Everyone in the room understood exactly who she was describing. It was a glimpse into the internal temperature of a woman who had been quietly building her case for years, waiting for the moment when the stakes became high enough to justify action. That moment arrived when the planning for William's future coronation began in earnest.
Less than 2 weeks after his father was officially crowned the king, Prince William is already planning his own coronation.
And Anne made a decision that would set everything that followed into motion. The coronation confrontation. She began meeting privately with William. She shared her fears plainly and without softening them. She told him that if Camilla were allowed to shape the foundational elements of his coronation, the line between symbolic support and real influence would become dangerously blurred. She was not speaking as a protective aunt driven by emotion. She was speaking as the most experienced strategist inside the palace walls, delivering a cold and honest assessment of what the stakes actually were. William listened, and what happened next changed everything. The confrontation between William and Camilla is the kind of scene that royal historians will debate for years. He entered the room at Clarence's house not as a grieving stepson or a polite family member looking to smooth over tensions. He entered as the Prince of Wales, the next King of England,
conservationist, father, and future king, Prince William.
and a man who had finally reached his threshold. For months, he had been watching Camilla position herself in ways that felt to him like a quiet claim on a future that was not hers to claim. He had watched the way she carried herself in ceremonial photographs, the way she spoke in planning meetings with an authority that seemed to exceed what her role traditionally permitted. And he had reached a point where the polite silence of the past was no longer sustainable. When the two sat down, there were no pleasantries. William was calm, which made him more terrifying than anger would have. He acknowledged the complexity of the current moment and everything Camilla had done to stand beside his father. And then he drew the line. He told her with the measured precision of someone who had chosen every word carefully, and that the planning for his coronation was a foundational statement for his future and his reign alone. He asked her to step back from the key planning committees. He told her that her presence in those high-level strategy sessions was becoming a distraction from the message of continuity and renewal that he and Catherine were working to build. He was not asking her opinion. He was informing her of a new reality. Camilla did not respond with tears or with anger. She responded with something that William found far more offensive: dismissal. She leaned forward, fixed him with a smile that held more condescension than warmth, and said with a tone that was almost amused, "It is all symbolic tradition, darling. Nothing more." She may have intended it as a de-escalation, a way of suggesting he was overthinking minor ceremonial details. But to William, the word darling landed like a slap across the face. And her characterization of symbolic tradition as something trivial was an insult to the very foundation of everything he was preparing to inherit. That word, that dismissal, that was the moment something in the Prince of Wales finally and completely snapped. He stood up. His voice did not rise. He did not shout or gesticulate. He simply looked at the woman who had spent years trying to win his acceptance and delivered a sentence that has since echoed through the corridors of the palace like a verdict. "This is not your crown to shape." Then he turned and walked out of the room without waiting for a response. His footsteps the only sound in a silence so heavy it felt like a physical presence. The silent realignment. The very next morning, William went directly to Princess Anne. He recounted every detail of the meeting, including the darling that had been the final straw. Anne did not need convincing. She saw in his resolve the same iron discipline that she had built her own life around. In that meeting between aunt and nephew, a pact was formed. Not a loud, dramatic pact of vengeance, but a quiet, strategic, and utterly ruthless agreement to realign the power structure of the palace before Camilla had any opportunity to counter it. What followed was a masterclass in internal statecraft. Within 48 hours of that pact being formed, the machinery of exclusion began to move. A secondary layer of communication was established, entirely separate from any channel connected to Camilla's office. Meeting agendas were revised. The real discussions were moved to private rooms at Kensington Palace and secure locations that Camilla's team had no access to. When her staff reached out for updates, they received polite, vague responses, citing administrative delays. Guest lists for planning sessions were vetted for loyalty. Anyone suspected of leaking back to Camilla's circle was quietly reassigned or simply left off the list entirely. Documents were rerouted through the Duchy of Cornwall channels, bypassing her office completely. It was a silent operation executed with the precision of people who had been trained their entire lives to understand that in the palace, the most devastating moves are always the ones that leave no fingerprints. Inside Clarence House, the atmosphere shifted from routine to something closer to quiet horror. Camilla's staff noticed the phones going silent. Invitations that had always arrived stopped coming. Daily memos became weekly, then stopped altogether. They could feel the walls closing in, but they could not identify the source of the pressure because the source was everywhere and nowhere at once. The psychological dimension of this exclusion was as deliberate as the logistical one. This was not just about keeping Camilla out of meetings. It was about making clear to everyone watching from inside the palace that the era of the consort's influence was finished. When she finally understood the full extent of what had been done, the reaction within Clarence House was described by those present as unlike anything the staff had ever witnessed. But by then, the gates were already closed, bolted, and the keys handed to a new generation. And while Camilla stood in the wreckage of her exclusion, something else was quietly rising on the other side of the palace. Catherine, the Princess of Wales,
with Catherine beside him, our new Prince and Princess of Wales,
stepped into the space that had opened and filled it in a way that felt inevitable. Where Camilla's growing influence had felt like an intrusion, Catherine's expanding role felt like the natural progression of something that had always been heading in this direction. She brought real ideas and genuine vision to the coronation planning. She proposed that young people from across the 4 nations have an active and visible role in the coronation procession itself. She found a way to honor Queen Elizabeth that felt like a living bridge rather than a monument to the past. Every idea she brought was met not with resistance, but with relief. The relief of people who had been waiting for exactly this kind of leadership. The contrast was not manufactured, it was organic, and that made it more powerful than any deliberate strategy could have been. The library letter, but perhaps the most consequential moment of this entire story, happened not in a planning meeting or a palace corridor. It happened in a private library at Windsor Castle, where King Charles sat alone with the full weight of what his sister and his son had put into motion pressing down on him. He had called Princess Anne to meet him there, not as a monarch summoning a subject, but as a husband desperate to protect the woman he loved. He spoke to her about Camilla's decades of sacrifice, about the public humiliation she had endured.
For years, Camilla was one of the most controversial figures surrounding the royal family.
And about everything they had done together to bring her from the shadows of scandal into the dignity of her current position. "She is my wife," he said, and the words carried the full vulnerability of a man who had finally gotten what he spent his whole life wanting and was now watching it be dismantled around him. Anne stood. She did not sit, and she did not soften. She listened to every word her brother said, and when he finished, she replied not with emotion, but with architecture. She reminded him that the monarchy does not belong to the individuals wearing the crowns. It belongs to the history that precedes them, and the future that must follow them. She told him that her loyalty was not to his personal happiness. It was to the institution. She told him with a directness that made the room feel smaller. "Oh, he is our future." And everyone present understood that she meant William, and that the word future in that context was not an invitation to discussion. It was a closing argument. Charles had no counter. He sat in the gathering silence of that library and felt the full weight of a truth he had been trying to avoid. His era was transitional. The future was already being written by someone else, and his sister was its most committed guardian. And then there was the letter, which is perhaps the most extraordinary piece of this entire story. Written by hand on a cold Tuesday morning at Gatcombe Park, bypassing digital security and formal secretaries because Anne understood that some things are too important to leave a digital footprint. 3 pages, handwritten, addressed to her brother, the king. A document never intended for anyone beyond the two of them, that somehow made its way into the circles that needed to read it. In that letter, Anne described the current trajectory of the palace as a slow descent into what she called a pageant of contradiction. A hollow spectacle where appearances had begun to matter more than purpose, where the pursuit of media approval had caused the monarchy to make compromises that previous generations would have found unthinkable. She never mentioned Camilla by name, because she did not need to. The target was unmistakable to anyone who read between the lines. She wrote about William as the last strong pillar of the family, a man capable of carrying tradition and innovation simultaneously, but only if his path was not cluttered by competing interests and overreaching influences. And she urged Charles to let go, not of the crown, not of his dignity, but of the personal battle he was fighting on behalf of his wife. A battle that she argued was costing the institution far more than it could afford to pay. She reminded him of their mother, of the loneliness she had carried with such unshakable grace, and told him plainly that sometimes protecting the greater good means pushing away the people closest to you. The letter was the blueprint. When Charles read it, he was not reading his sister's private thoughts. He was reading the collective anxiety of an institution at a crossroads, filtered through the mind of the one person inside it who had never once placed herself above it. And in the silence after reading those final lines, whatever argument he had left simply disappeared. The doors will reopen. The smiles will return, and the world will be shown a monarchy that looks unchanged. But inside the corridors of the House of Windsor, the architecture of power is no longer what it was. Princess Anne has made her move. Prince William and Catherine, Princess of Wales, are stepping into a future that feels less like preparation and more like quiet succession. And Queen Camilla now stands at a crossroads few in royal history have faced. Crowned, yet recalculated. History rarely announces its turning points. It disguises them as routine, protocol, continuity. Only later do we recognize the moment the balance shifted. So as the palace settles into its carefully restored calm, one question lingers in the silence. When the next chapter of The Crown is finally written, who will truly hold the pen?